Kaiser's Century Farm, 6 miles downstream, was tested, and the results showed extremely high levels of pesticides and stillage, and was ranked as dead water, unable to sustain life. They lost all of their fish. Finally, NDEE ordered AltEn to shut down operations and notified owners and the manager that the plant had until March 1st, 2021 to clean up the site. And that meant that the plant had to divest itself of the 84,000 tons of wet cake piled on the site, as well as deal with 175 million gallons of wastewater. But NDEE wanted to know the plan for that in advance, rightfully so, and said nothing would be done without the agency's approval. So when AltEn blew through NDEE's deadline, the state filed its 97-page, 18-count lawsuit, citing the findings in the agency's more than 77 site visits and more than a dozen letters of violations and warnings that fines could be levied at the rate of $10,000 per day per violation, but no fines were ever levied. So while the lawsuit was a much needed step, the fact that it took 97 pages to list all the violations over the years begs the question of the state and NDEE, where were you? By April of 2021, the UNMC and the University of Nebraska announced the assembly of a 10-year, $10 million investigation into the short and long-term effect of AltEn. This study is designed to be far-reaching, but most importantly for the people in proximity to the plant and for former employees of the plant, it will look at the human health impacts over time. During the 2021 legislative session, the unicameral passed a bill banning the use of treated seed corn in Nebraska if the byproducts can't be used to feed livestock or applied to land. This bill does nothing more than just codify the regulations already in place, the ones you saw on the seed bag label. It is by no means enough. In the summer of 2021, AltEn began selling off all its assets, tangible assets. All but 3 employees were laid off after the plant was shut down, but remaining there was Scott Tingelhoff and his wife, who is, I'm told, in charge of worker safety and environmental quality, believe it or not, and the company controller. Astoundingly, Saunders County supervisors paved the way for AltEn to sell off its cattle feedlot by granting the new owner a conditional use permit, despite AltEn's property tax delinquency and the unknowns about how polluted the soil is under that feedlot. Also in April, the Perivallon Group hosted a town hall in Mead, and it was a hearing of sorts, just to allow the people of Mead, to tell their individual experiences. So I will leave you with a couple of things. The first being OSHA. Treated seed is coated in a powdery dye in certain colors like green or red, which supposed to indicate at a glance what pesticides are involved. So there is a video of a plant employee who was sent into an enclosed space to move treated seed with a shovel when a hopper at the plant broke down. I believe that's been posted on the Facebook page, What About Mead? That video has been. But when he emerged, he was covered in green dust, and then he was blown off with an air hose. The dust covered his clothing, his hands and face and his hair, and it blew off of him in a green cloud. So neither he nor the man operating the air hose were wearing PPE, except the guy on the air hose had a hard hat on. Calls from Mead citizens to the regional OSHA office have gone unanswered, but that we're told that that's because the previous administration gutted the agency at the federal level. I was just out around the plant on Friday to sort of prepare myself for this presentation. And there were workers standing out on the piles of wet cake in t-shirts, jeans, and ball caps. Not a mask, no PPE whatsoever on. I wanted to tell you about this too. Secondly, you need to know that the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act requires the chemicals and the compounds used on treated seed to be registered, thus regulated by EPA. But the act also exempts treated seed from being registered because the EPA argues the chemicals and the compounds are already registered and regulated, and there's no need to duplicate efforts according to EPA. And this was tested in 2016 in a California court, and the court sided with EPA. Thirdly, AltEn remains delinquent in property taxes the last time I checked. And we're talking about $500,000. In addition, nearly $1 million in mechanics liens have been filed against the plant, and those companies that have filed are largely Nebraska companies. I get this question all the time. Who's going to be left with the bill for the cleanup of this disaster? Well, we don't know, because of transparency. One of the questions I have is, will Stan and Evelyn Kaiser's pond be drained, dredged, repaired, and restocked? When will people in Mead be able to enjoy the outdoors again? Are Mead school children safe at recess when they run and play and breathe the stench? Finally, it's become painfully obvious that there's no plan in existence for how to properly dispose of the pesticide-laden wet cake and the wastewater from an ethanol plant. Why? Because it was never supposed to happen. Under the law, treated seed cannot be used in ethanol production if byproducts can't be fed to livestock or land applied. So we have a lot of loopholes to fix. Thank you for your time. I'll turn it all over now to Dr. Shallis.
Dr. Chalice, you are muted.
Here we go. Good now? Okay, so I'm John Chalice. I'm a professor at Creighton University in the biology department, also a member of the environmental science degree program. That is my email if you want to contact me afterwards. That's a good way to reach me. I happen to spend my summers on research in coastal Georgia. That's where I'm speaking to you from right now at the University of Georgia Marine Institute. But my attention throughout the period I've been down here is often called to Mead because of the complexities and what you just heard from Lisa is a very good introduction to why we have problems. So I'm going to try to explain more about why these problems are so important and severe. And somehow I'm sorry, trying to, oh, here we go. There we go. And you heard from Lisa about the toll that this problem is taking on local families. And I've recently talked to Emily and Ray Loftus. They have 2 young children, and they live just north of the AltEn site in a century-old house that they've lovingly restored. I spoke with them recently. Their 2 main questions for me were, is it safe for our children to live here? Should we sell and move away? So this diagram shows how close they are to the northwest corner of the AltEn property. And they can, their stories completely confirm everything Lisa has just told you about the problems. So this is, you might ask, why am I involved? It's not, I'm doing pro bono. I'm not asking for anything. I just feel that this is a service to give back to the community in Eastern Nebraska.
Dr. Chalice, your slides are not advancing.
Oh, no. Let's see if I can get that fixed. You see it now? You slides now?
Nope.
Okay. I may have to start this back up. I'm really sorry. I thought everything was all set to go. So let me close my PowerPoint and bring it back up. That may be what should be needed here. Okay. Now, do I need to reshare?
Yes.
Okay, share screen. PowerPoint. Right. Walk off in a second here. Okay, do that, and let me try to advance to the. That's the second slide. Can you see that?
Nope, it's still just showing the screen.
Ah. Okay, so let's try. Terrible. This is not supposed to happen. Let's try. Can you see this screen?
Yeah, you're on the second screen now.
Yep.
Okay, we're just going to work with this, and I won't try to put it to full screen. This should show up well enough, and I could probably make this a little smaller too. Okay, so this is Emily and Ray's children, their property, a 100-year-old house that they've restored, and how close they actually are to the AltEn property. It's very, here's the northwest corner of AltEn. Okay, I want to put this in some geographic perspective. Those of you that are from Saunders County may well have heard that there's an ancient valley when the Platte used to flow through this area, but 27,000 years ago, during the last ice age, it changed course. But this is Pod Valley, named for a former geologist that studied this area. And it's a very large system, about 30 miles long, 7 miles wide. I've outlined the area. This is the site of AltEn, okay? The valley represents or is underlain by a very thick alluvial material, sand and gravel beds that contain what at one time was a very high quality aquifer. It still is in many places, although it was already contaminated by a munitions plant near Mead to the south and very close to the AltEn site during World War II and beyond, I think into the Korean War. And a lot of chemicals did already invade the soils and the groundwater, and that's being cleaned up by a Superfund site injunction. And it's been a long-term project, and it's been very expensive. It's ongoing probably for the next several decades to clean up the groundwater already contaminated. So AltEn is just adding to this problem. Modern valley soils are mostly a Peoria loess soil. We're in that region of loess soils and cultivated prairie soil. And it should come as no surprise that a major part of the land use here is agriculture. This is from Google Earth, and very early on when I was invited in March, I decided I need to know some things for myself. First of all, where did the water go that runs off of this site where the ethanol plant is? And so these green, blue, and magenta lines show 3 pathways that I traced out, and it's since been pretty well confirmed in terms of USGA maps and everything. And we know that these are critical areas in terms of what has come off at the surface from the AltEn plant. And there probably is actually an additional release at times down the west side of the property along Route 10. But these are the primary routes. I'm going to go through this very quickly, but anybody can go online, and there is a USDA website called Cropscape, and you can choose an area, select an area of size of interest, and see over a almost two-decade period now what the crop covers and other land uses have been in that area of interest. So I did this for the area around AltEn. Not surprisingly, there's a lot of green, and which is soybean, and yellow, which is corn. That accounts for 68% plus of the land use in this particular quadrant that I showed. And you can see AltEn's location here. Here is Mead. I'm also showing the Lincoln well field down here that is in that flow path. Okay, so a pretty typical story of eastern Nebraska and rural agricultural land. There's a lot of other smaller land use areas, but it is primarily for the corn and soybean agriculture. This is a view I took from the southwest corner of the plant, just off of Road 10. And I wasn't actually over the plant, but I got an oblique view. You can look up Route 10. Here is the AltEn from the south. You can see a field here with Angus cattle grazing on this land. You can see a lot of water hanging around. This was after a flood event after heavy rains in mid-March, and I'll come back to that event. Lisa told you about the contents of and the markings on sacks of feed corn, and this is just to refresh her point that there are a number of different fungicides and insecticides used in different formulations depending on the seed company, and they compete with each other to get the best product to protect your crop. And this is fungicides, a mixture of fungicides to protect the young seeds, especially if it's a wet planting season. And the insecticides, as Lisa explained, are systemic, and you'll hear a lot more about that from Judy. And also just a reminder that there are color dyes that are added, and these are as warnings, never to be consumed by humans or put into animal feed. And as Lisa said, not to be used in ethanol production. Okay. The systemic pesticides are generally water soluble. That's not typical for many pesticides that are more attracted to soil and in animals to lipid tissue. They're hydrophilic, but not these systemics. These are more they're hydrophilic, they're attracted to water, as opposed to others that are hydrophobic, I meant to say. Readily absorbed into different tissues of the plants. This solubility enables these pesticides to move more easily and transport in surface and groundwater, a very key idea here, and to enter food chains in both aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. So they're much more mobile spatially than many pesticides. Neonics, as is the common name for neonicotinoids, globally are now the most widely used insecticide. They effectively poison the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors and nervous system signaling of insects. That leads to rapid death. It shorts them out. Judy will tell you more about this after mine. But I want to mention that this is not our major synaptic transport system. So we aren't shorted out like an insect, like a bee or a butterfly. But that's not to say that there aren't other problems with exposure to these compounds. Lisa explained pretty well the process of fermentation to make ethanol. It's a long known process, but important to the story here and what I'm telling you is the fermentation part of this process, where after the milling and cooking into the mash liquefaction and then into the fermentation tank, often with amylase as an enzyme, but most importantly, yeast. Everybody knows yeast is all around us, these cells, and it is very good at in a closed system like this to produce ethanol. So that's how it's done. And the ethanol is distilled to products. But important to note here is that those distillers' grains, the solids or wet cake that Lisa talked a lot about, also comes out of this procedure and this distillation unit. In Mead's case, they're not supposed to, and apparently we don't think, dried it to use directly in animal feeds, but that led to a lot of solid waste. And there's plenty of liquid waste to go around too. I want to make it very clear that the fermentation process did not destroy the seed coat pesticides. But even more importantly, some fractions of those pesticides in the metabolic reactor and heat of this fermentation created what we call metabolites. These are residues with altered chemistry. This makes the toxicology a whole lot more complex. Different seed coatings contain different pesticides. It wasn't one single combination. So there are dozens of potential pesticides and some, 3 or 4-fold that potential metabolites that could be in this waste. This is truly a witch's brew of toxicants. I want that to sink in because we've all heard that term. Massive amounts of the solid wet cake were stored on site, as Lisa's just demonstrated. High volumes of liquid waste stored in the open lagoons and tanks now getting moved into the Poseidon tank. They contain very high levels of pesticides and their metabolites. And these we know have leached already into soils and have run off into streams. Witness the example from Kaiser's property, which I'll also come back to at the end. And this is especially critical during storm and flood events, where there's more prone to be sheet flow that can pick up and accelerate this movement downstream and down aquifer. AltEn mixed this toxic wet cake with soil and applied it to local farmland in clear violation, we believe, of statutes. This was to be soil conditioners, and people accepted this at no cost. Like, oh, this is going to help us grow crops. Even NREC, the ag station, accepted early on some of this material. And Lisa told you about that problem. Also, they decided that they could make another perhaps marketable product using a pyrolysis to biochar the wet cake. They assumed that this pyrolysis would break down the pesticides into non-toxic, even inorganic forms. Not the case. You would know if you use charcoal that that is a product of wood pyrolysis, and that does not break down the organic matter that you burn in charcoal. But it probably complicated even more the complexity of the chemical mixtures with this pyrolysis event. The wet cake piles and waste lagoons, as mentioned, generate noxious and very likely quite toxic air emissions. Large amounts of AltEn derived pesticides now, as a result of all this, contaminate soils, waterways, and probably the groundwater on site. It's in all likelihood that's true. And as it moves more slowly than surface water, surrounding and downstream of the AltEn site and treated farmland, and wherever the wind may carry it. A couple key toxicology concepts, as I'm going to get into now, impacts on organisms, and primarily sticking with animals. So I put together this. I teach environmental toxicology at Creighton, but this is, if you use this as sort of an acronym, I wouldn't try to pronounce it, but standing for solubility, volatility, hang time, ability to invade, dosing, indirect effects to other organisms, and wild cards. And I'll talk about those more in a second. So solubility is simply the ability to enter water, or if it's insoluble, to bind to soil and sediments. That's generally the two important fates. But also in toxicology, we have to understand that things can vaporize, and these pesticides certainly can, and are leading to this stench, along with the fermenting manure and other materials that are in this waste. So volatility, either it stays grounded, if it isn't volatile, or it drifts into the sky, and then it can go downwind. In the westerly belt that we're in is Omaha, for instance. Hang time, stay or leave. What's the half-life? How long do they stay once they get into an area? And that's a really important question to understand what's at stake after the exposures. Ability to invade, overcoming barriers. How do they get into organisms? Often by either ingestion of food or water, but they also can pass through skin barriers or other barriers potentially, okay? Dosing, and everything in toxicology is dose dependent. What might be completely safe at one dose can be moderately toxic at another dose and have adverse consequences, or could be very toxic. Now, some materials aren't necessarily negatively or adverse. In plants, for instance, some of these materials may actually help in terms of positive responses and get more growth out of it. Hence the logic of pesticides. Indirect effects, these are indirects on others in proximity. So if you highly affect one species that are in contact, either as predators or competitors, can be highly affected by the indirect effects, even if they're not toxically affected. And then finally, wild cards. And one of the most dangerous of that is when you get these mixtures of toxins, you can have more than just added effects. It can be multiplicative in a way that gets very nonlinear and very dangerous. If two or more are present, things are less predictable. Okay, and I'm almost done now, but I want to finish with a little bit more. And this is really scary and too much science to expect you to just absorb quickly. But what this is a paper that looked at fungicides and their fugosities, their likelihood to go into different phases depending on the class. So in the left are fungicides, herbicides in the middle, insecticides on the right. So we won't worry about the herbicides. And also is worth pointing out, this paper, fungicides, an overlooked pesticide class. There is, as much as we don't understand about the relatively novel nicotinoids, we understand less right now about fungicides in the environment and their impacts. So this is the ability on a log scale of fungicides, herbicides, and insecticides to either at a higher number, this is KOW, be hydrophobic and not go into water, or at lower levels, which the fungicides and the insecticides as systemics are toward this lower level. So they're much more water soluble. This is binding to soil, sort of the reverse. So what's likely to be attracted to water is not likely to bind to soil so well, okay? This is the log of water solubility itself, and it's very relatable to this, what we call coefficient of octanol and water partitioning, but you don't need to know that. Just know that there is a very large orders of magnitude range in these properties, and that's why it's complicated to predict where things are going. You need to understand what phases and media they're going to end up in. This is log of water half-life, so highly different results in different pesticides and maybe in different water chemistries and conditions and temperatures, and log of soil half-life. So all of those have to be understood to properly model and understand what is happening once these things, once the horses are out of the barn, once they get into our environments. Now, for the nitty-gritty, what you've probably been waiting to hear from me as somebody who teaches and is involved in toxicology, what does it do to animals? And especially the ones that are not targeted, but diverse vertebrate groups, and humans are very much a vertebrate group. And so this is from findings from a number of recent studies. What can this do to the human body and other animals? Nervous system impairment, effect on brain development and abnormalities, behavioral abnormalities. And this has been seen in wildlife, for instance. Embryo death, low birth weights. That can't be a good outcome. Longer term damage to major organs, lungs, heart, and liver. Endocrine and immune system disruptions. This is a very big area of environmental toxicology and toxicology in general, understanding how these very important systems for organism health and function are affected. The products, the pesticides, are not meant to do this type of disruption, but it turns out they can, and they do. Reduce fertility in animals, genotoxicity, and this is really bad because often genotoxicity can mean mutations, and many mutagenic materials are also carcinogenic. Cellular oxidative stress at the very lower levels of the systems are cells themselves. Younger individuals are generally at greater risk. And that's an important take-home point. We've got to protect our children. That's usually what we try to do as parents, and it should be what state and federal is out to do too. Wild cards, much less is known about. So here's as much as we do know, here's what we don't know enough about. Effects of long-term, like time cumulative chronic exposures. It's not just acute in a lab or a field setting, but long-term exposures, and especially the long-term effects on humans. We know that some carcinogens can take decades to manifest to a cancer. Non-target toxicity of the fungicides. Really important to know more about that. We don't know enough about it yet. Toxic synergistic interactions of different seed coatings. Here's the witch's brew concept coming back to bite us. It's bad enough in single doses. You get these mixtures, and it's far more complicated to predict. And likely, if there's positive synergisms, which has been demonstrated in several cases with fungicides and neonicotinoids, the results are even worse than additive effects. Environmental transport and half-lives, we know some things, but not enough to do all the modeling for a specific site like Mead. And then beyond individual organisms and species, what about the biological communities and whole ecosystem effects? very quickly, because I know I've gone over, but very quickly, this is a satellite view right after our 2019 disaster in eastern Nebraska. Don't need to repeat what happened, but I want you to know that this was taken in the height of the flooding. The Platte River's out of its banks. This is Clear Creek along that flow path, and it's carrying very dark water, and you can see it in a frontal boundary right now with water flooding the Lincoln water supply well field, and it's very close, and later on could well, even if it didn't reach exactly where the wells are, there's a combined aquifer here that it could have. So this was a major event, but what about maybe less major events? But here's what it looked like 5 days later with same satellite. This is the European satellite, 10-meter resolution. So you can see a lot of detail. This is a blow up. This creek, Johnson Creek Reservoir, was frozen before the event. It's now virtually thawed out. You can see this really dark material. That's the contaminated water held in the upper parts of this reservoir. And path 2 is what comes through the Kaiser family's property and pond. So I want to take you now to that site, down flow path 2, and it doesn't even have a name, this creek, but it comes into the Kaiser's pond, and is just what has been a beautiful setting, and the family liked to fish. This pond was actually built by his Stan Kaiser's grandfather. It's been around a number of decades, and after the February 11th digester tank rupture and a subsequent big runoff event in March, a lot of material got past the barriers put up, and this was a receiving area. And it got through here and downstream too, as we could see clearly. And also, and the flow path 1 is carrying down Clear Creek. This is Clear Creek over here. So it's also worth noting that there was a dieback event in their pond in 2016 after a spring runoff event. And they didn't appreciate at the time that this was coming from AltEn. They didn't understand why the fish had died. I took this picture of drone in late March after that spring runoff event that complicated what had come off of the digester, but there was still digester. This is black water right as it goes under Road 9 right here, and this got carried into the flow path. And finally, last slide. This is a view of the Kaiser's pond. Recently, they provided a picture. This, by the way, was published in a very important article by Chris Dunker, who has been spot on his coverage. I think he's on right now. Hello, Chris. I want to give him all the credit here for this article, Wastewater from AltEn Found in Kaiser's Pond. So there's their pond. This is the couple, Evelyn and Stan, and their lives have been turned upside down by this event themselves. So I'm going to stop there. Sorry if I went a little over, but hopefully that got the points I wanted to make across. So I'll stop share now and turn it over to Dr. Wu-Smart. Judy.
Thanks, John. I'm going to share my screen. Right. There we go. So I am just going to continue on where my colleagues have left off, and just kind of share some of the stuff that we've been doing, kind of summarize some of the places that we are. I wanted to start really quickly with a little bit of my background, because a lot of people know me as kind of the bee researcher, the entomologist, but I've been studying factors that contribute to the decline of bee health for more than a decade now. And most of that focus has been on pesticide exposure, particularly neonicotinoid insecticides. My appointment at the university is 50-50 research and extension, so it's a little different. I spend half my time focused on research, applied research in this area of pollinator conservation. And then the other half of the time I spend engaging with the community and stakeholders and interest groups, trying to understand some of these factors that contribute to their decline, as well as try to find ways to mitigate and manage for a more sustainable future. And so my role today is really to just put some context in the bee losses, and then really illustrate what the systemic pesticide pollution is. Lisa and John have talked about it before, touched on it, and I just want to kind of really clearly define this, because this is a huge area that is not being addressed right now. And then finally, just follow up with some other things I wanted to highlight in terms of the complicated risks and challenges to try and understand what's going on here. So I did start at UNL at the beginning or at the end of 2015, and the video here I'm sharing is really of just kind of showing you what these bees coming out of the colonies look like. We spent a couple of years trying to rule out the on-farm practices and really trying to figure out and isolate what exactly is causing the bees to die in this one particular area with several locations holding our bees. On this research site, we were conducting separate research looking at how we can mitigate neonicotinoids from treated seed from coming up from during planting and drifting into pollinator habitat. So using tree lines to mitigate that exposure. And I had a PhD student looking at the plants and air particles at this site, trying to determine whether we can strategically place habitat in areas that would reduce the exposure risk to pollinators. And so through that research, we uncovered, this is just kind of a map shot of the research site outlined in blue, the ethanol plant in red, and then the pink markers are where our hives are located, anywhere from 1 to 3 miles away from the site, and some continuous waterways. So through her research, we found that there was highly contaminated milkweed leaves on the property, somewhere between 3,000 to 5,000 parts per billion of this neonicotinoid cocyanidin that we mentioned before. That was really, really high results and unheard of, really. So we contested those results for a number of years to confirm them. We met with NDA and EPA the beginning of last summer to follow up with them, because a lot of the highly contaminated pesticide laden plants were closest to waterways. So you can see here, those were areas where we saw vegetation, and then coming towards inland, we had much lower levels in comparison to some of the plants collected right along those waterways. And this was over in this area here. So there was a lot of interest focused at that point in the water. After meeting with EPA and NDA, they suggested we put a few more colonies out. We noticed losses, again, consistent with what we were previously seeing. On the right, you can see these dead bee traps with very few bees in them. These are from locations outside of the Mead, Nebraska area, so other areas across the state. And the bee losses in our preliminary pesticide results on some of the plants, as well as the pollen collected by the bees, indicate that there is a real high concern for systemic pesticide pollution in the air, as well as the leaching of contaminants into nearby plants. The problem is we're not entirely sure where or how far these residues have spread. So Journal Star article by Dunker estimated or reported that they were processing 600,000 to 900,000 pounds daily. The estimates for over the past 5 years is quite large, although we don't really know exactly how much treated seed has been processed to the facility, what is still on the property, what was moved out, what has been transferred to landfills. AltEn, like Lisa mentioned, was shut down in February of this year. However, the need for treated seeds still persists. So where's it all going? Like Lisa said, this is a local issue with national implications. So we want to keep that up front, because the more that this story is told, the more that the neighboring states and other states that are affected are going to start looking into this more. So this is just kind of an aerial map of just kind of the issues. Lisa and John had talked about it. I just want to point out the 3 lagoons were here, and then the wet cake piles are 3 of them right here. I'll refer to them as the north and the east cake piles. And if you looked at the Google Earth, and you can kind of use a timestamp to kind of toggle across time, you can see just last year in March, you could still see some of the coloration of the effluent going into the lagoons, the green coloration, as well as this very large pile of east wet cake waste, approximately 430 feet long by 300 feet wide. and very tall. This pile of wet cake was taller than me, about 7 to 10 feet tall. So these photos were taken in July of 2020. We followed waterways up to try to figure out what was at the upstream of those waterways, and led us to this east side West Cape pile. You notice last summer, there was no protective liners or measures to prevent runoff or leaching into the soil. You can see some dead zones, vegetation dead zones near and around those wet cake piles. This was this summer, March of 2021. Still, you had some snow melt and some rain there. Again, parts of that pile did not have any protective soil berms or preventative measures for runoff. Reports from NDA show that the wet cake from the harvester had levels as high as 554,000 parts per billion clethoanidin. That is extremely high. I want to point out that the amount of pesticide found on a single seed, as high as I've seen, was about 200,000 parts per billion. So in this process, somehow some of these compounds are concentrating or elevating in terms of their residue levels in some manner I'm just not quite sure of. Unfortunately, a lot of the wet cake was utilized as a soil amendment, and we have about 33,000 tons of it was distributed to local farms between 2018 and 19 before farmers were aware of the amount of residues that were in these byproducts. And just to point out, like Dr. Shella said, that there's a lot of fungicides and herbicides and other insecticides present. So unfortunately, the toxicity and the impact of these chemical mixtures are really unknown. And that's a real concerning problem for us researchers, as well as I think the citizens should be pretty concerned about as well. And just to kind of give you some pictorials or some visuals of what we're talking about in terms of systemic pesticide pollution, these neonicotinoids can be put on by the foliar spray or seeds treatment or soil injection. And we've been talking about this for decades in the bee community because the residues can be taken up, moved through the soil and taken up and by vegetation expressed in the nectar and pollen as well as leaves. And that's where the wildlife are being exposed. But we also are very aware of the fact that these chemicals can move through the environment, making it really challenging to kind of estimate what that exposure level was. That would be in the dust off from corn planting or from planting of treated seeds, movement in the soil, as well as the leaching into the water source, which then can be picked up or moved in the soil and up the vegetation. So that's what we mean by systemic pesticide pollution. This is a really big problem because we have a lot of residue studies or pesticide studies on plants from various researchers that show that these residues can show up at really low levels, and that's usually on crops that have seed applied, pesticide treated seeds. Once they've been planted, the plant grows, then the levels expressed in that nectar and pollen is quite low. But if you're talking about soil injections, those levels get much higher. Agricultural crops tend to be anywhere between 20 to 100 parts per billion. And where I'm going with this is that the higher vegetation or the plants that seem to have the higher levels tend to be associated with things that are more of the urban landscape uses, pesticides that are applied to woodier plants, ornamental plants. And you can see even when it's soil applied to a tree here, you're only getting about 2,000 to 3,000 parts per billion, much lower than what we were seeing in those milkweeds. So why these are really important chemical pesticide tools is that they're really been useful for treating root feeding and leaf mining insects that are really hard to treat with foliar sprays or other conventional pesticides. And so they've been a popular tool for farmers to control these pest populations. And where we've been particularly concerned is that expression in the nectar and the pollen. And again, our PhD student had mentioned or had found levels as high as 5,700 parts per billion in clethoanidin. So our follow-up is to determine what is being expressed in the nectar and the pollen of these plants. And I showed this graphic just to kind of summarize what Dr. Shalas mentioned, was that there's a lot of data still missing. From the 90s, this graphic was to show the persistence of one kind of neonicotinoid can be anywhere from several months to more than a year, depending on what kind of soil, whether it's a loomy or very organically dense soil type. So there's a lot of variability in terms of how persistent these compounds are in the environment. We still don't know if they're bioactive, meaning if they're in the soil and the water, can they continually be taken up by the plants each season or each time they're growing and tapping into the soil and the water? Can they accumulate in plants? Much of this is unknown still. And unfortunately, what I see on site is in March, there was a lot of water. There was a lot of flooding. This excessive water really indicates high potential for leaching of pesticides into the surface area, into the surface water. This is an image of the northwest wet cake pile. And in May, in that same area where you saw a lot of flooding, what do we see now is a lot of flowering wild muster, or flowers that are attractive to pollinators and other wildlife. And that could be a very potentially high exposure route for them. This is one of the drone imageries from May. While the focus has been on cleanup at the site, I can't help but notice how much yellow is on that site right now. That is just blooming vegetation that is attractive potentially to a lot of different wildlife. And a lot of that, we just don't know how much is coming into that vegetation. Moving on to the east-west cake pile, in March of this year, we saw a lot of flooding. This was really concerning because you could see the water, although it's a little bit hard to see, you can see that the water is being disturbed because there's flow of water going from this direction onward. And this was right after that heavy rain in mid-March. And the next day we went to investigate a little bit, and you could see that while the soil berm has been reconstructed here, you definitely see a flow of water directly from that wet cake in that direction. So for me, a lot of these questions that come up, you know, when I'm looking at the drone imagery, I can't help but wonder how functional are these soil berms. You can see that there are these soil berms that are meant to hold back runoff and prevent leaching, but how easily are they breached during heavy rains and flooding like we got last night? Even if these aren't being ruptured, and some of these soil berms obviously look like they've been reinforced or soil has been added because it looks very different than other parts of the barriers. This might be because of the liquid is just kind of permeating through those berms. But again, that lends itself to the question of, well, how are these berms keeping residues from leaching into the soil and down the soil and into the nearby plants? So there's a lot of things that I think are not being addressed in this issue. One other thing is our previous studies show that there were high levels of pesticides in the airborne dust a mile away. So we don't know if that dust is coming from the movement of treated seeds into these hoop houses and into the property, or is it dust off from the wet cake piles? But this dust off does really pose a further concern for respiratory exposure and risk. This is a video of some of my research hives out in Minnesota when we were studying neonicotinoid impacts on queens. This colony is not being fed pesticides. It's got some sugar syrup and an exit so it can fly in and out. When I pan over, this colony is being fed a very similar neonicotinoid at 50 parts per billion, quite low compared to what we're seeing in the water and the wet cakes and the milkweed levels. And you can see how the bees are completely cognitively, locomotively impaired. They're not functioning like a normal colony does. And I point this out because I want to make the point that a pesticide doesn't have to outright kill a bee to harm the colony. There's these sublethal and indirect ways that can contribute to these loss of pollinators in a very significant way. This is what I'm seeing in the field. I'm seeing bees dying in the colony mid-feeding. I'm seeing butterflies and other monarchs cognitively, locomotively impaired. So while this isn't outright killing the monarch, imagine how these butterflies are more susceptible to predation, desiccation, weather extremes, or just being unable to find shelter when needed. So there's quite a lot of these ecological impacts that are potentially indirect or sublethal to a point where we are a little bit concerned about what we're seeing and their ramifications and the amplification of this. So butterflies are not supposed to be, you're not supposed to be able to pick them off of the flowers like that. And in that middle picture, you see that the landscape is filled with these milkweeds and other flowering forbs in here that are potentially very attractive. And on the left, you see a bee that is died inside the plant stem and leaf. That's a location where a lot of times bees and other insects will collect water or plant glutation for hydration purposes. This summer, we did notice a number of dead monarch larvae, caterpillars on the milkweeds itself. Now, milkweed monarch caterpillars tend to be a little bit more sensitive and higher, more prone to pathogens and other diseases, but it is notable that we are seeing a lot of loss of insects right on the plants themselves. So why are we caring? Or why are we assessing the plants' pesticide levels, the amount of damage that we see on these plants, and the diversity of visitors in these plants? It's important because not only do we want to examine these local insect populations, who's being impacted and what's being contaminated, but these insects are allowing us to help identify some of the hot spots of where these contaminants are going and determine maybe some long-term impacts. How long are these chemicals persistent? The amount of money that it takes to do pesticide testing is really extreme. So we have to find other ways to monitor the impacts on a landscape like this. So I know not everybody is thrilled about bees and insects, but think of them as the canaries in the coal mine. We're utilizing these insects as tools to understand the greater problem. So I want to just go back to systemic pesticide pollution to summarize. It is not just neonicotinoids we're talking about, although the focus here has been on neonics. We're talking about lots of different, several kinds of fungicides in that mix as well that can be systemic. They move from the water into the soil and potentially can be expressed in the leaves, the nectar, the pollen, where the wildlife may be exposed. And why I'm bringing this up again is because there's no regulatory division at EPA to address this kind of pollution. We've got a lot of robust regulations existing for air pollution, water pollution, waste pollution, solid waste pollution. But this right here, where it's coming up and expressed in vegetation, is not being addressed, although I'm told that there are internal discussions happening. Why this makes our life really difficult is because there are other sources of the same chemicals coming into the same landscape. So you have what's coming off of the ethanol plant, as well as what normally is being used for common farm practices. And this is really kind of difficult to tease out what is coming from the farm versus what's coming from the ethanol plants. And the other complicated issue is that not everything is being impacted in the same way. Bees are highly sensitive. Bees and other insects, like Dr. Shellis mentioned, are highly sensitive. There's subunits to those receptors that are more likely to bind to those compounds than your mammals and your other birds. So the variation in terms of who's going to be harmed is very wide. So before we can understand the impact of this, we have to first know which compounds, what levels, where, when are they harmful? And tracking those contaminants in the air, the water, the plants, the soil, that's how we're going to really determine how to really talk about what's the impact to the community here. I really like this review article. I strongly suggest anybody who wants to learn more about neonicotinoids and their impacts broadly across a number of taxonomic groups to take a look at this paper. And I think this diagram does a really nice job explaining what's happening here. We have a suite of animals shown at the top row there. And each of these animal types may be exposed to these compounds in different ways. And that may be illustrated in green if it's being exposed to plants, or gray is air, brown is soil, and water is blue. So for example, bees are most likely to be exposed through the plants in the air, as green and gray illustrated, whereas your amphibians are more likely to be exposed by the water. So that is a really nice example to show you that there's different exposure risks. So that pesticide residues and pulling off how much is coming in from where will help us determine who's at the highest risk. Are the pesticides mostly coming in from the soil, the water, the plants, or the air. The second thing we have to determine is we're using these really highly sensitive bioindicator species that seem to be quite impacted at low levels. But you also have to consider that mammals and other animals happen to be less sensitive. So the effects might happen at high doses or after prolonged exposure. So balancing research to study all of these huge extremes is quite difficult. But if you think about it in two different phases, it makes a lot more sense. There's a lot more knowledge gaps in these animal systems that are less sensitive, and a lot more understanding of what happens in the bioindicator species. But we can't forget that these bioindicator species are also food web support. They provide food for all the other animals that you see over here. So the loss of the food support is going to potentially impact these higher animals over here. That's going to require long-term monitoring. So we're using short-term monitoring methods to determine the impacts of these invertebrates so that we can make more, prioritize the research and make better predictions about the long-term impacts on these other systems. What I am seeing on site is that there are indications that we do need to look in this area. On the left, you can see that my dead bees are being eaten by what I think are skunks or other small mammals. And then on the left, you can see this bird here is quite unaware of my presence, as well as my technician's presence, who's on the other side of the colony. And this is a pretty abnormal behavior from a bird here. So I think it does warrant that we need to look deeper into some of the other ecological impacts that are happening in this area. Unfortunately, because there is such a complicated mixture, no uniformity or the potential limit of the amount of pesticides present in not just the liquid effluent or the discharge, but also the wet cakes, the EPA is unable to conclude whether the use of these byproducts will result in unreasonable adverse effects on humans or the environment. And that to me is not the end of the story. I think we need to look deeper into this. The reason why is Dr. Chalice has kind of showed you the maps. I just want to finalize by kind of blowing this out and just look at the large area, at least of what we know of right now. The need to assess environmental and ecological impacts off-site is critical. All the focus right now is on-site, that little star right in the middle of the image. But we've documented potential impacts at least 6 miles out. And this is just what we know of from citizens that have recognized and observed impacts on their local wildlife as well as themselves. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done in terms of determining how much farther these contaminants have spread, to what extent, and to where they are being exposed: the water, the soil, the air, the vegetation. And both Lisa and Dr. Shellis has mentioned that we found that it was reported that there was a pair of beavers that had been found just last week. And I bring this up because while the chemicals may or may not have directly killed these beavers, it's the beavers represent a significant change in the environment in this area that is alarming. Whether this beaver died from exposure to some kind of toxin, algae toxin, or the dead water, or consequences of lost food supply or contaminated food supplies. We don't know exactly why the beavers died, but we are seeing sick and dying animals in all these areas that make us very concerned of the ramifications off-site. And that's why I really want to emphasize that the focus cannot just be on the facility and the property itself. We need help in determining how far it's moved and where these impacts and these contaminants are. So we are trying to take this One Health approach because of the complicated nature of this entire story. This is still a work in progress. There's still a lot of moving partners in and out. I do want to thank and acknowledge the tremendous work led by UNMC and Dr. Dean Kahn and Dr. Rogan, as well as Three Rivers Public Health, Saunders Medical Center, UNL researchers, as well as Creighton University researchers and USGS researchers that have been starting to contribute. This is the brain, the think tank that is starting to trying to determine and identify exactly what's happening. I do want to mention though that we are all doing this kind of as a side because none of it is funded. We do have that private donation, but this is in addition to all of the work that we are currently doing in our individual labs. And so consider the amount of work that needs to be done and the amount of resources and people that we have to try to do this work. It just doesn't mesh well. So we need help there trying to reinforce what is being done and support the efforts of these fine folks here. And then lastly, I just want to just bring out that this whole local issue has re-energized the discussion over treated seeds. And this used to be touted as a safer option than conventional pesticides. But there's been a lot of really great articles talking about the unintended consequences of this popular practice and what we're starting to learn and uncover and piece together after decades of concerns and research. So if anyone has not seen this, this is a very well done article looking at how the farmers have used this product, what are the benefits, pros and cons of this product, and where we are now with this. And then lastly, I want to thank Senator Blood for her efforts. This has been incredible, incredibly challenging to get recognition for this issue. We know it is a huge and critical Nebraska health issue right now, but it's been a long time running for a lot of us. We've been working on this for a long time. So the speed at which we have generated momentum from has really been thanks and through the efforts of Senator Blood. I also want to recognize the other senators that attended the listening session, because through them and through all the folks that have been keeping this in the media and making folks aware of it, this is how we're going to get things done. Through those efforts, you know, even the discussions in Nebraska, it's permeated other neighboring states. I want to just list here, there's a number of states that are starting to recognize and act on, you know, their own concerns about the stewardship of this product, as well as potential restrictions or needs to look into disposal. And so the language up top is just that exemption, the federal exemption that makes it difficult for the state to act. And there's a number of, I'm sure I'm missing a few. So if you guys know of more efforts, please reach out. I'd love to continue to document these. And that's it. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to step in and first of all, apologize that we went a little bit over. As you can see, we really couldn't avoid going over a little bit. But I want to really briefly ask that all of our experts go ahead and take a look at the chat box, because I know there's several questions that need to be answered. As promised, I'm going to be really brief and just talk a little bit about the legislative concerns. One of the things that's come about from me meeting with these great people is it's clear that we need to tweak our delayed impact statute here in Nebraska. So the general status of limitation in Nebraska for people with personal injuries is 4 years. Now, as you heard Lisa say when she spoke, we know it's going to take years for problems likely to manifest themselves. And so I always like to call these bills compassion bills, because we have to be compassionate to our neighbors. It's not fair to not step up to the plate and make sure that they are protected in 10, 20 years when we know that we're going to start seeing more and more types of bodily injury that's a direct result from the exposure to toxic chemicals like these neonics. So we've already actually sent that one up to bill drafting. We're very excited about that one. And I saw that former state senator, now Councilman Preister, had asked what they could do to help. One of the things you can do to help is that when these bills come forward, you can write letters of support or come in and testify. The other things that we're looking at, as you just heard Dr. Judy talk about, there are issues when it comes to storage and disposal that pertain to certain chemicals. We have a couple issues with that. Not only do we want to have better guidelines here in Nebraska, but we're also concerned that companies that are in arrears when it comes to their taxes and other issues and fines, that they shouldn't be allowed to continue to receive money from the state if they've not paid those past due fines or taxes. It seems like a waste of taxpayer dollars, frankly. And then another concern that's come about is that it's quite clear that the policy that NDEE has to follow is flawed, because they can clearly cite and they can find harm, but there really doesn't tend to be any language that really has teeth when it comes to how and when they pull the trigger. And they really tend to lack any real authority when it comes to this type of crisis. So what is the purpose of having an agency that oversees something that really can't do anything? And then the other concern that we have right now that I want to say has nothing to do with legislation, but it is concerning for, I think, all of the citizens in Nebraska, is that we have been made aware that certain state agencies are now meeting behind closed doors with the citizens of Mead. I find that very concerning because we've worked very hard as a group to bring everything into the forefront to make sure that the public knows exactly what's going on, what questions are being asked, and how they're being answered by the agencies whom we ask these questions of. So that's the contribution that I want to make, but you have so many questions. I want to make sure that our experts go ahead, and they're all adults, so I'll let them decide who's going to talk and when. But I just appreciate everybody's patience and sticking with us today. You saw that there was a lot of information, and these people are some of the smartest people I've ever hung out with before, and I feel privileged to know all of them.
So there's a question in the chat about, didn't the original proponents of this plant fully research Langley? In a word, no, they did not. The second question is, do you believe there's a connection between the lack of action by the Ricketts administration and campaign contributions by AltEn to Ricketts and the Nebraska Republican Party? I haven't spent a lot of time researching his Langley's or AltEn's or the myriad of LLCs involved. I haven't spent a lot of time researching their political contributions.
Dr. Chalice or Dr. Wu-Smart, do you have any answers to any of the other questions that are being asked in the chat there?
I know there was a couple of questions about how we can help and support. I know that there's, I think, spreading the word and getting the legislators on board and talking to your community on making sure people are aware that this isn't just an issue that's impacting Mead, Nebraska. This is a Nebraska issue. This is affecting our water quality. This is going to affect farmers, and this is going to affect a lot of people, not just the communities of Mead. And so I think that's what people really need to understand. And I hope that people can kind of spread that word and share about the efforts. And I don't know, Dr. Chalice, Lisa.
Judy, there's a question about, have the cattle at the feedlot been tested? I know you've talked to, well, they're saying, they make a good point. What happened to the cattle originally there and the ones there now, since the feedlot has been sold and has presumably got cattle in it? So
It certainly is a challenge. We are working with the new owners to try to work out a sampling plan or some kind of way to go on property and try to sample environmental samples or something. I don't know if we have the permits or the permission to sample the cattle itself, but there was also a lot of questions about what is that going to tell us, because they, like you said, it might not be the same cattle. They might be just coming in and coming out. What part of the cattle do we need to sample? And what is that going to tell us? If the concern is over how much of it is entering the food chain, we need to kind of go further along the production line in order to really assess that and make sense of that knowledge. So we're still trying to figure out what would be the appropriate questions to ask in order to get the answers that we need to know for human health concerns.
And I see there's a question from Larissa Schultz. She says she believes that the soil conditioner was applied near her home. And she's got the AltEn smell going on. Maybe you should talk a little bit about how people can report. I mean, that's stuff you want to be alerted to, right? For testing, you or your team, so that you can go out and do testing.
Yeah, we have doctors Daniel Snow from the Nebraska Water Science Laboratory and Shannon Bartlett Hunt, who has been working on the water testing. We certainly are interested in hearing about community members who are impacted or concerned. These folks are testing the soil and the water. I don't know what their work plan is or how what their timeline is in terms of reaching folks, but I'm going to post the website to reach the UNMC website team, and then also the fund raiser website for folks that are interested in helping us. I would strongly encourage you to reach out to the researchers directly if you have concerns about particular sampling.
Well, I see that we are starting to lose participants.
Dr. Shallis, you're muted.
So one closing piece I'd have is it's so important to get this cleaned up as soon as possible and as effectively as possible. It's one thing to do a bad job of cleanup. It's another thing to do this right. And it is going to take, very likely, to remove the pesticides from the soil and the water, measures like have been taken for the current Superfund site out there, which involves incineration at a very high efficiency to break down these organics. And that means scooping soil up. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be very expensive, but there are probably no other ways to get this done. And it's going to take federal assistance almost certainly, because the state by itself, and hopefully the seed companies will continue to support this cleanup.
Well said. So I'm going to turn it back over to Green Bellevue since we went over our allotted time. But I just personally want to thank everybody who stuck through the hour and a half with us and all of our experts. And I'm hoping that you're leaving today with a better knowledge of why this is so pressing and how if we don't figure this out, this is going to happen elsewhere in the United States, if not also somewhere else in Nebraska. So with that, I'm turning it to you, Green Bellevue.
Thank you. Thank you everybody for joining us today. A huge thank you to our presenters, not just for educating us about this, but also for going out there and doing that on the ground work, that investigative reporting and that research that is so important to finding out what's actually going on. And in reality, going towards preventing future issues like this. So thank you again. Next month, join us on September 12th from 1:30 to 3. We are discussing recycling, both here in the local Omaha area and the state of recycling in the world. So there are a lot of great links that were posted in the chat. Check out our presenters' work and keep doing your own research to keep understanding what's going on, not just in our community, but elsewhere. So thank you to everybody and have a great afternoon.